Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. The last video we started to investigate the book Beatles 66, The Revolutionary Year by Steve Turner. And it was great to jump back into the year when the Beatles stepped back from touring, and it gave them more time to do things that interested them, and it made them even more creative. So we'll find out what they were up to today. Before their experiences with LSD, the group was more atheist and agnostic. When they started to read about Buddhism and Hinduism, they were less dismissive of religion in general. They would talk about God and the significance of the spiritual. They became neo-pantheists who believed that everything was a part of God and that God was a part of everything. George was the Beatle most interested in religion, and he got that through Indian thought and culture. Now we come to Patty and George getting married. They were engaged less than a month when they got married January the 21st. John, Cynthia, Ringo, and Maureen were in Tobago, so Paul was the only Beatle there for the ceremony at the register office in Epsom, Surrey. Brian picked the location thinking it would be a low-key venue and would avoid too much attention. Patty always wanted a white wedding in a church, but George told an interviewer that I don't want a white wedding. If it weren't for all that business with the vicars and sniveling people, I might have been married 10 times by now. There was no music at the ceremony, and only a handful of guests: Paul, Brian, who was the best man, Neil Aspinall, Tony Barrow, model Venetia Cunningham, and ad man Terry Howard. George's parents were there, and his 3 brothers, Patty's brothers and sisters, and her mother Diana, and her mother's cousin Penny Evans. Her mother's brother John Drysdale gave Patty away in the absence of her divorced father Jock Boyd. John and Ringo had married working-class girls from the Liverpool area. George married a model from a prosperous middle-class background. Patty's mother Diane said it was an exciting day when Patty asked if she could bring George home to dinner. Diane said the children loved him, and she did too. She said, "He's such a fine boy and such a gentleman." And Patty recorded the day's events in her diary when she got married. 8 o'clock, got up. 8:30, the press man came. 9:20, left for the registry office. 10:40, we were married, yippee. 11:10, arrived home. From then on, party. So Paul was then the only single Beatle, but all his fans figured that after 3 years with Jane, he was going to marry her. Paul, though, was still amorous with others. At the launch party for Indicative Books and Gallery on January 28th, Paul was seen with Maggie McGivern, a 20-year-old nanny who was hired by Marianne Faithfull and her husband John Dunbar for their baby son Nicholas. She was a former model and a Marquee Club disc jockey. By April, their affectionate friendship became a full-blown affair. Dunbar stated that she was a very earthy, working-class girl, unlike Jane. McGivern had a boyfriend at the time. That meant that both of them were cheating on their partners and had to sneak around. They could meet at accidental encounters at public functions, and this loose arrangement worked for them. McGivern said she was doing her thing and Paul was seeing her when he could. She said when they were together, we were together. The fact that it was secret suited me down to the ground. Everyone then got back to town, and George postponed his honeymoon, thinking there was going to be an album with songs that had to be written. The Beatles wanted to grow artistically with their music. They didn't want to rest on their past formula. By changing, they risked losing the people that got them where they were. They felt they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't extend their capabilities. John said, "We just do the music. If more people like it, then that's all well and good. If less people like it, it's just the way it's going to go." Paul wanted to educate existing fans by gradually introducing more challenging work, rather than confusing them before they were ready to get used to it. When the Beatles were asked if the Beatles were trying to lead the kids little by little into deeper music, John replied, "There's no plan. It just went that way. The next one will just happen. There were no plans to it. We only think, let's make one better than the last LP. How did the last LP go? Oh yeah, let's go. We have no specific plans. We just always go forwards, that's all." George looked back on songs such as P.S. I Love You as being basic pop. George said, "They got typecast as the yeah, yeah, yeah mob, and I'm so glad we've grown out of that into thinking players." Journalist Maureen Cleaves created an article on February 1963 with the title, "Why the Beatles Create All That Frenzy." She wrote, "They don't sound like the Shadows, or anybody else for that matter." She said they look scruffy, but scruffy on purpose. Their hairstyles were French influence. They bursted with self-confidence and professional polish because they'd been honing their craft since 1958. She said John had an upper lip which was brutal in a devastating way. George was handsome, whimsical, and untidy. Paul had a round baby face, and Ringo was ugly but cute. I don't think Ringo was ugly, but she felt that they were more intelligent than the average pop group. The Beatles liked the way Cleave dealt with them, and she was one of their most trusted newspaper allies. She interviewed them separately, and the first was Ringo. He took her on a tour of the house and garden, and she saw all the rooms, the goldfish pond, a tree house, the kennel for 2 Airedale dogs, a wartime air raid shelter, and a patch of newly flowering crocuses. Ringo didn't talk about music, and there wasn't a drum kit on the premises. He never rehearsed between tours, and his tastes were like an uncultured person who had suddenly come into money. He indulged in his childhood passions for cars. He had 2 Minis, one Rolls-Royce, one Vassal Vega, and he had guns, knives, pikes, air rifles, cannons, military memorabilia, trophies, uniforms, and the Wild West. The only books on display were science fiction. Cleave found him the least brilliant Beatle, but he was also the most sensible and the most mature, and she was impressed with the aura of contentment that surrounded him. His wife was at his side most of the time, and both of them doted on their 5-month-old son, Zach. He grew up poor and missed a lot of school because of illness. He said he could read okay, but he found it hard to write because of problems with spelling. He told Cleave he wasn't thick, he was just not educated. People, he said, can use words and I won't know what they mean. In the time before the hippie movement, Ringo was all about peace and love. He moved to Weybridge to be close to John and George. While Clive ate lunch with the Starr family, Pattie Boyd called on the phone, and John popped over with Julian. Ringo told Cleave the great thing about being married was that you could have a house to sit in and company all the time, and you could still go to clubs, a bonus for being married. I love being a family man. And when George and Patty got back from their 16-day honeymoon to the British colony of Barbados, Cleave interviewed George. Cleave knew the public didn't know much about George. He was the good old George, and Cleave sensed steeliness beneath the unsophisticated exterior. She thought he was strong-willed and uncompromising, with a high regard for truth and rights, and she thought he was more likely to act independently. He was one of the first Beatles to move out of London, and the first to embrace the music of India. He introduced the group to transcendental meditation in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. He was also the first to say he was disenchanted with his pop star status and materialism. He told her, "I got more famous than I wanted to be. Okay, we're famous Beatles, so what? There are other things apart from being famous Beatles. It's not the living end, is it? On the other hand, I feel I've seen twice as much as most people do when they peg out, and I'm very pleased that I'm me. After all, I could have been somebody else, couldn't I?" He wanted craft more than celebrity. He spent hours practicing his guitar. He played Bach's Prelude in C major to songs from 1964 stage musical Hello, Dolly. He had a music room with tape recorders, walls full of guitars, and a jukebox. He said he thought of going to India to study the sitar, even if it took up to 6 years of his life. When he discovered the music of Ravi Shankar, he said it was just like everything you've ever thought as great music coming out all at once. He thought that Patty was improving his taste. He wore a Cartier watch, drove a Ferrari, and he also had 2 Minis in his garage. He graduated from a standard northern working-class fare such as toast, steak, chicken, beans, eggs, and chips to what he said was the avocado scene. The house had a conservatory with plants, a print by the Australian artist Sidney Lowell on the living room wall, decorative bound books of French books on natural history, and furniture that was updated to reflect his current outlook. The Beatles had always presented a unified front. As they grew up, found partners, and developed their own interests, it was harder to stay unified. They wanted to give their own opinion on the hot issues of the day. They wanted to be free to offend if necessary. In their early Hamburg days, they had been rude, outspoken, and lacking good manners. It irritated them that Brian domesticated them in order to achieve popularity. George said we should have stuck out for all that. We only cut our hair and said the yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir bit to get in. George talked about war, religion, and authority with Cleave. George thought the Vietnam War was wrong and that anything to do with war was wrong. George, he didn't like authority figures, ranging from teachers and Roman Catholic priests to the Prime Minister, who at that time was Harold Wilson. George said about religion, "I think religion falls flat on its face. All this love thy neighbor, but none of them are doing it." He said he could never be Pope until he sold his rich gates and posh hat. Well, with these statements, you think that people would have got riled up a little bit about what George was saying, but it was what John said regarding the popularity of the Beatles compared to the popularity of Jesus. The statement threatened their record sales, their lives, and to the end of their career as stage performers. John would later say, "I always thank Jesus for the end of my touring days. If I hadn't said that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus and upset the very Christian Ku Klux Klan, well, Lord, I might still be up there with all the other performing fleas." Cleave was closest to John out of all the Beatles. She respected his sharp, humorous, untrained mind. He respected her intellect, perceptiveness, and learning. She could see that he was more complex and original in thought than the other Beatles. He was also full of contradictions. He was a hard-working musician and songwriter, but he was also lazy. The champion of the downtrodden, but he liked to be chauffeur-driven and a Rolls-Royce with tinted windows and a TV. He was the dedicated artist who could say, "I want the money just to be rich." She described it as imperious, unpredictable, disorganized, childish, vague, charming, easygoing, tough, and quick-witted. So Cleave, when she interviewed him, did what she did with Ringo and George. She looked at his possessions and worked out what they said about him. In John's case, they showed his immense curiosity and unsystematic way of learning. He had volumes on natural history and India with books by Tolstoy, Huxley, Tennyson, Wilde, and Richmal Crompton's series of Williams books for children. They showed his impulsiveness and low boredom threshold. A suit of armor, an old family Bible picked up at a shop in Chester, a gorilla suit, model racing cars, records of sitar music, a porcelain cat, and a slot machine. In the sitting room, there was 8 little green boxes with blinking red lights. John said that he got them as Christmas presents, but hadn't given them away, and that they'd carry on blinking for a year. They cost $25 and were a short-lived craze in the late 1965 and early 1966, when some boutiques on the King's Road sold them. John was introspective. He used that to stimulate his songwriting. Any spiritual exploration involved John revisiting the Christianity of his past. He wasn't raised in a strong Christian environment. He was sent to Sunday school at an early age to keep him out of trouble. He joined the church choir, was confirmed, and for a brief time went to a Bible study for older boys. This gave him a framework that he would return to even if he challenged it. He said in a 1964 interview, he was brought up by the Church of England and by my aunt. When John was 20, Aunt Mimi told him she didn't really believe in God at all. He said she was right to send him to give him a chance to decide for himself whether to believe in God or not. When John left school and music started to take up his time, John stopped attending church, but wealth, adulation, and his drug experiences made him reconsider spiritually. When John made his Jesus quote, it was thought that it came after the conversation he had with Cleaves about India. John had played her sitar music on a record, and on his shelf was a book, 41 Years in India, by Field Marshal Lord Roberts, a British soldier. Roberts had stopped the Indian Mutiny of 1857. John asked her, "Don't the Indians appear cool to you?" John said their music is thousands of years old. It made him laugh, the British going over there and telling them what to do. When he made the statement, he was thinking more about Britain than America or mainland Europe. Throughout his life, he spoke warmly of the values of Jesus, but he was critical of priests, popes, bishops, evangelists, Jesus freaks, and organized religion. Before he died in 1980, he said in an interview that people got the impression that I was anti-Christ or anti-religion. I'm not at all. I'm a most religious fellow. I'm certainly not an atheist. John talked about where he lived, and he said Weybridge wouldn't do it at all. He was just stopping at it like a bus stop. Bankers and stockbrokers lived there. He said he would take his time and get a real house when he knew what he wanted. In 2005, Cleave told Steve Tyler that John was clever. He was clever but badly organized, clever and lazy. The thing about John Lennon was that his mind just darted around. I will stop the video here. In this video, we found out more about the Beatles from an interview that journalist Maureen Cleaves wrote. and she was able to gain insight from each Beatle by seeing where they lived, how they decorated their homes, and by the items that they had in their homes. She was also able to get them to open up on what was on their minds. I didn't get to the Paul interview because it was going to make the video too long, but we'll get to that one in the next episode and even more besides that. So I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help me to know I'm going in the right direction. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.